morning and welcome to the thoughts for the day on this 7th day of June. The scripture for the morning comes from Psalm 5 and verse 2. Hearken unto the voice of my cry, my King and my God, for unto thee will I pray. Reading the Bible in a year, we need to read 2 Chronicles chapters 28 and 29 today and John chapter 17. The thoughts of the day. The good news of the gospel is that there is a resource of divine mercy which is able to overcome a contradiction within our souls which we cannot overcome ourselves. The man who hates God is not far from the kingdom. It is the spiritually indifferent man who has placed himself almost beyond hope. Our greatest natural resource is the minds of our children. The motivational thought for the day, cheerfulness, it would appear, is a matter which depends fully as much on the state of things within as on the state of things without and around us. On this day, in 1878 in Britain, the Wigan Pier disaster killed 200 people. In 1921, the first Parliament of the Northern Ireland was opened on this day. In 1939, King George VI of England became the first British monarch to visit the United States of America. In 1942 and in World War II, today ended the Battle of Midway in the Pacific with a victory for the United States against Japan. In 1942, on this day, faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap tall buildings with a single bound, the publication of the first Superman comic. In 1966, on this day in America, the first colored student to graduate from the University of Mississippi, James Meredith, is shot in the back and legs. In 1967 on this day, Israeli troops driving into the Egyptian territory reached the banks of the Suez Canal during the Six-Day War. The personal story of the day is entitled Follow God or Fail. The scripture comes from Isaiah chapter 52 verse 6. Therefore my people shall know my name. There are scriptural references from Isaiah chapter 52 verses 1 to 15. Isaiah's entire life was spent under the shadow of threatening Assyrian power, and he witnessed the ruin of his nation at their hands. When Isaiah was a young man, all of northern Israel was taken captive in 734 BC. 13 years later, Samaria fell, and the rest of Israel was carried away. Then the Assyrians came into Judah and carried away 200,000 captives. When Isaiah was an old man, the Assyrians finally were stopped at the walls of Jerusalem. That's recounted in 2 Kings chapter 19. This verse starts out, Awake, awake, O Zion. Zion is one of the hills on which Jerusalem stands, so Jerusalem is often referred to as Zion. Isaiah predicted that Jerusalem would not fall into defiled hands again in verse 1. King Hezekiah repaired the temple and re-established the services there. He was a king who was dedicated to God and to the spiritual rebirth of the nation. Often, the passages in Isaiah have meanings that extend beyond their immediate context, and that may be the case here, since the total redemption of Jerusalem won't occur until the return of Christ to earth. In the first verses of this chapter, we see God's promises to restore his people, verses 4 to 6. Then in verse 7, Isaiah tells us the good news. Peace and salvation are found in God. The people will be comforted and will burst into songs of joy because the Lord has redeemed Jerusalem. Verse 9. The ways of God are often unexpected and contrary to the order of things and our way of looking at the world. Here is a dramatic example. In the divine irony that brought us salvation, the servant is highly exalted and wiser than kings, verses 13, 14 and 15. Repeatedly in Isaiah, we have seen Jesus referred to as the servant. How is your aptitude for service? Since we are followers of Christ, this is an important question. The devotional thoughts for the day, and the first one is entitled Protection. A friend's married daughter called from her home in another state to report some, quote, bad news, unquote. She had 2 cavities in her previously flawless teeth. She asked, does your city fluoridate its water? A couple of days later, she called again to say that it did not. As a result, her teeth were more vulnerable to decay than when she grew up drinking fluoridated water. Admittedly, this was not a great tragedy. Worse things can happen. But her dental problems can point us to a vital truth in our Christian lives. We would be wise to do all that we can to prevent tooth decay. But it's even more important that we do all that we can to prevent Satan from harming us spiritually. And we can read that in 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8 to 9. We're talking here about spiritual decay. To ignore the prescribed protection that God has made available to us is to ask for trouble, much worse than holes in our teeth. In Ephesians 6, Paul said that to be protected from Satan's attacks, we need to put on the whole armour of God. Read verse 11. In verses 14 to 18, he tells us that we must put on the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shoes of the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, along with all prayer. With God's armour, we can stand and stay protected. The second thought is entitled Betrayal by Brothers. The scripture comes from Matthew 24, verses 10, 11 and 12. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Love will grow cold even among Christians, brothers, or former brothers who themselves have fallen and abandoned their faith will, out of the bitterness caused by backsliding and jealousy, betray their brothers, just like Judas betrayed his master. Perhaps this betrayal among brethren is the most unpleasant of all. We can understand that the world hates us, or that strangers or even religions attack us. However, when formerly warm and caring individuals who used to love and follow the truth try to hide their backslidden conditions by betraying those who previously had fellowship with them, it can be devastating. Lawlessness will abound even in the church. People will take the law into their own hands and do as they please. Man will make his own laws and be his own master. This spirit is already active and working to spread out even further. People willingly listen to a talk and want to be blessed or moved by God, but they refuse to obey him. When a brother lovingly corrects us, we become angry and want to retaliate. This desire to get even, to harm those who believe have hurt us, is the very spirit that brings on betrayal. Perhaps this is the most tragic of all sins. But even for this, there is forgiveness. There was no hate or bitterness in Jesus' eyes when Judas kissed him. After all, it is not surprising that even those who hate us still know how to kiss Jesus Christ. The facts of the day: elephants are the only mammals to have 4 knees. That's because they've got 4 legs. Of all the water in the world, only 2% is fresh water. One lighter moment for today. Here are some regulations from the Department of Army in the US for the operation of aircraft, and this regulation commenced in January 1920. The first one: don't take the machine into the air unless you are satisfied that it will fly. Okay, never leave the ground with the motor leaking. In taking off, look at the ground and the air. Never get out of the machine with the motor running until the pilot relieving you can reach the motor controls. Pilots should carry hankies in a handy position to wipe off their goggles. In case an engine fails on takeoff, land straight ahead, regardless of obstacles. Learn to gauge altitude, especially on landing. If you see another machine near you, get out of the way. Do not trust altitude instruments. Before you begin a landing glide, see that there are no machines under you. Hedge hopping will not be tolerated. Pilots will not wear spurs while flying. Do not use aeronautical gasoline in cars or motorcycles. If an emergency occurs while flying, land as soon as possible. Sound advice, absolutely. Thoughts in verse for today. And we move on through the wonderful chorus, Desert Song. And this song is a little bit different in its arrangement. We next have verse 3, and there is then what's called a bridge, which is something you repeat, but it's a bit like a verse, and then we move on to the chorus. So verse 3 says, "This is my prayer in the battle, when triumph is still on its way. I am a conqueror and co-heir with Christ, so firm on his promise I'll stand." Then the bridge says, "All of my life, in every season, you are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship." And then you repeat that. And then we move into the chorus, which says, "And I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory, and he is here." Wonderful words to meditate on and think about. The closing thought for today: Lord, help me to use the gifts that I have been given. Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and we look forward to your company again tomorrow morning. Have a blessed day. Bye for now.